Huxley, who from the outset constituted himself the chief propagandist of Darwinism, was more logical. He made no bones about the total absence of any actual proof of evolution. In fact, he greatly annoyed Darwin by harping on the point, as anyone who cares to peruse the 5 volumes of Darwin's letters and the 2 volumes of Huxley's may discover for himself. My God, wrote Darwin to Huxley in 1862, is not the case difficult enough without its being, as I must think, falsely made more difficult? I believe it is all my own fault, my own Candor, more letters of Charles Darwin, 1-230. This outburst was in consequence of Huxley having pointed out in his lecture and books that so far it had not been possible by selective breeding to produce a form capable of breeding but infertile with the parent stock. Huxley, in admitting this lack of evidence, said in his Edinburgh lectures in 1861 that if it could be shown that such failure was a necessary and inevitable result of all experiments, he would hold Mr. Darwin's hypothesis to be utterly shattered. Man's Place in Nature, Every Man edition, page 256. He added, however, that he looked for early proof to be forthcoming. In a letter to Darwin, Huxley said he told his students that he was satisfied that 20 years scientific breeding experiments with pigeons would provide the necessary proof. Huxley's Life and Letters 195-6. Although so heatedly rebuking Huxley in 1862, Darwin himself 8 months later privately admitted in a letter to Dr. Bentham the total absence of any proof of evolution. This is what he wrote under date of May 22, 1863. In fact, belief in natural selection must at present be grounded entirely on general considerations. When we descend to details, we can prove that no one species has changed. For example, we cannot prove that a single species has changed, nor can we prove that the supposed changes are beneficial, which is the groundwork of the theory, nor can we explain why some species have changed and others have not. Darwin's Life and Letters 3:25. Darwin died in 1882. Huxley died in 1895. 4 years before he died, Huxley wrote to Professor Romanes that evolution still stood without the evidence on which he had insisted 30 years before. He had always insisted, he said, on the logical incompleteness of the theory, so long as it was not backed by experimental proof. Huxley's Life and Letters 2, page 291. We now pass onwards another 30 years and we find the noted English evolutionist Professor Sir William Bateson acknowledging exactly the same total absence of any proof of evolution. This is what he said to the Congress of the American Association for the Advancement of Science in Toronto, Canada, in 1921. When students of other sciences ask us what is now currently believed about the origin of species, we have no clear answer to give. The conclusion in which we were brought up that species are a product of summation of variations ignored the chief attribute of species, that the product of their crosses is frequently sterile in great or less degree. Huxley very early in the debate pointed out this grave defect in the evidence, but before breeding researches have been made on a large scale, no one felt the objection to be serious. Extended work might be trusted to supply the deficiency. It has not done so, and the significance of the negative evidence can no longer be denied. Nature, April 29, 1922. 6 years later, another prominent evolutionist, Professor J.B.S. Haldane, in his book Possible Worlds, page 38, said in 1927, the barrier of interspecific sterility is the most serious argument against Darwin's organic evolution. It is equally a barrier against any other kind of organic evolution. In 1931, we find the great Professor H.F. Osborn of the United States, described by Britain's Royal Society as the greatest paleontologist of the day, making the following remarkable statement to a Congress of the British Association. We are more at a loss than ever to understand the cause of evolution. One after another, the Buffonian, Lamarckian, Darwinian, Weissmannian, and de Vriesian theories of causation have collapsed. All that we can say at present is that nature does not waste time or effort with chance or fortuity or experiment, but that she proceeds directly and creatively to her marvellous adaptive ends of biomechanism. Nature, September 28, 1931. This is an admission by one of the high priests of science that all theories of evolution have collapsed. Buffon propounded a general theory of evolution. Lamarck, tutor to Buffon's children, followed with an idea of evolution by inheritance of acquired characters. Darwin advanced the idea of gradual small changes by natural selection. Weismann put all the emphasis on the germ plasm, and de Vries put forward the ideas of evolution by mutations or sudden large variations. 2 years later, on again Professor James Ritchie, the great zoologist of Edinburgh University, wrote in Nature of September 30, 1933, the problem of the origin of species seems to be as far from solution as ever. In September 1939, Professor Ritchie delivered the presidential address to the zoological section of the British Association and had nothing further to report. The existence of life, he said, must be considered as an elementary fact which cannot be explained. In admitting life, the biologist may build up a whole body of biological theory, logical in the logic of probability. Nature, September 23, 1939. Everything was down to mere shadowy probability. The above series of pronouncements by front-rank biologists covers the entire period of 80 years since the first proclaiming of the Darwinian gospel. There is no more vestige or proof of evolution today than there was in those early days when Darwin privately and Huxley openly admitted its total absence. Claims are made from time to time of the production by experiment of new species of living things, but they rapidly drop out of sight in the above series of statements at scientific headquarters. Is sufficient evidence that no such claim has survived examination. This evidence is vital to the evolution theory, and if it were forthcoming, we may be quite sure it would be proclaimed from the housetops all over the world, for all the world to hear. If this evidence is lacking, it is not for want of seeking it. For example, a whole literature so extensive that a bibliography of it was recently published has grown up about the breeding experiments with the pumice fly Drosophila melongasta. Mr. Douglas Dewar, a fellow of the Zoological Society and one of the few British biologists rejecting evolution, in his challenge to evolutionists, paragraph 20 to 21, relates how in 1910 Morgan and his collaborators hit upon the idea of experimenting with this quick breeding fly. And there's lots more information on that fly and the experiment. Evolution's case today. The first thing noticeable about modern presentation of the case for evolution is the widely different ideas held by various evolutionists as to what constitutes proof of a proposition. If we make our starting point the article on evolution in the current 1929 edition of Britain's standard reference book, the Encyclopaedia Britannica, we read that evolution is supported by overwhelming evidence. If we turn to certain of the recent presidential addresses to the biological sections of the British Association, we shall find scientists there affirming on exactly the same evidence that evolution is not a proved fact but purely a matter of faith. We live in an age of propaganda circulated throughout the world from obscure sources for obscure ends. Perusal of some articles in the successive post-war editions of the Encyclopaedia Britannica shows in various cases a haphazard reversal of view between one edition and the next, and in particular a change from a factual to a propagandist view of evolution in the 3 brief years between the 13th edition of this work of reference in 1926 and the 14th in 1929. In the 1929 edition, 2 eminent biologists combined to write their general article on evolution. There is a brief, very positive and very dogmatic introduction by the biological editor and editor of the edition, Professor Julian Huxley. He's probably related to the other Huxley. There was a lot of Huxleys around those time. Thomas Adolf, etc., then professor of physiology at the Royal Institution. But when it comes down to cold hard facts, a great part of the positiveness fades away in the main part of the article. Written by Professor E.S. Goodrich, Professor of Zoology and Comparative Anatomy at Oxford University. Both these ardent evolutionists make weak starts. The first item is an announcement by Professor Huxley that among competent biologists and geologists, there is not a single one who is not convinced that evolution has occurred and is occurring. And Professor Goodrich, on taking up the running, immediately asserts that it is now universally held by all competent biologists that evolution is a fact. These statements are weak for two reasons. In the first place, they suffer from the defect of being untrue. There are some fully competent biologists and geologists who have publicly rejected the entire theory of evolution as baseless. A list of them will be found on paragraph 102 to 105. In the second place, the statements are weak because the truth of a scientific proposition is not to be established by counting noses. Professor Julian Huxley's own eminent grandfather expressed himself very freely on this matter of nose counting. Government by average opinion, he wrote, is merely a circuitous method of going to the devil. Those who profess to lead but in fact slavishly follow this average opinion are simply the fastest runners and loudest speakers in the herd which is rushing blindly to its destruction. Huxley's Life 2:125. When theologians state that most people believe in the existence of God Almighty, evolutionists like Professor Julian Huxley tell us this is merely evidence of the prevalence of superstition and credulity. On the other hand, credulity in scientific circles apparently turns fancy into fact. Besides being unreliable and then nose counting, these two eminent encyclopedists are illogical in their deductions from it. However, it appears that there is secondary support for evolution beyond the mass of scientific noses upholding the theory. Professor Huxley assures us in the encyclopedia that by now the evidence is overwhelming. The evidence is as follows. 1. Fossils, which are stated to provide complete proof. 2. Vestigial organs, that is to say, useless parts remaining from ancestral forms of being. 3. Embryology, showing the embryo developing through ancestral forms of the species. In addition, the general plan of plants and animals is said to bear witness to a common descent. Their geographical distribution is described as easy to explain on evolutionist lines, but difficult otherwise. Also, evolution is held to have pragmatic value in explaining things. The foregoing are simply the general considerations, which Darwin, as we have seen, referred to in 1863, in privately admitting the absence of any rag of proof that any living thing could change into any other kind of living thing infertile with the parent stock. Professor Julian Huxley passes over this total absence of real proof of evolution without notice. The decline of the Encyclopaedia Britannica from a factual to a propagandist work of reference is evidenced by referring to the article on embryology appearing in the 13th edition 3 short years before Professor Julian Huxley was holding forth in the 1929 edition. This 13th edition article was written by Professor Adam Sedgwick, Professor of Zoology at the Imperial College of Science and Technology. Professor Sedgwick dismisses as baseless the idea that fossils, embryology and vestigial organs provide any proof at all of evolution. In discussing the Darwinian theory as elaborated by Haeckel, that the embryo in developing recapitulates the ancestral history of the species, Professor Sedgwick says of this class of evidence, when we come to look for the facts upon which it is based, we find that they are non-existent, for the ancestors of all living animals are dead, and we have no means of knowing what they were like. It is true there are fossil remains of animals which have lived, but these are so imperfect as to be practically useless for present requirements. Moreover, if they were perfectly preserved, there would be no evidence to show that they are the ancestors of animals now living. They might have been animals which have become extinct and left no descendants. Thus, the explanation ordinarily given of the embryonic structures referred to is purely a deduction from the evolution theory. Indeed, it is even less than this, for all that can be said is something of this kind. If the evolution theory is true, then it is conceivable, note, not it is certain, or even it is probable, that the reason why the embryo of a bird passes through a stage in which its pharynx bears some resemblance to that of a fish, such as are present found in fishes. Professor Sedgwick remarks incidentally that although fishes have teeth, no teeth are to be found in bird embryos. Birds don't have teeth. In Professor Sedgwick's view, what Professor Julian Huxley calls overwhelming evidence is no evidence at all. The evolutionist can find a succession of fossil remains of different types of animals in different geological strata, but that present animals are the descendants of extinct ones is pure assumption. The whole evolutionist case is made up of one assumption placed on the top of another assumption. All is guesswork from start to finish. Before going on to the main evolutionist line of complete proof in the fossils, the minor accounts are worth looking over. With respect to the common plan of plants and animals, this amounts to little. All plants and animals have to live in a common environment of land, air, and water, and a common plan is just as much to be expected on creationist as on evolutionist belief. As to geographical distribution, Darwin wrote to Hooker that to get his species about the world, he was always ready to raise up former immense tracts of land and oceans if any case required it in eminent degree, adding, at present I much prefer land in Antarctic regions. You have thus to invent much less land, and that more central. More letters 115. If Darwin could do this, the Almighty should be able to manage it also. As to evolution's pragmatic value in explaining things, one finds an evolutionist author, Mr. A. Beebe, quoted as writing quite seriously in his book, The Bird, The Idea of Miraculous Change, which is supposed to be an exclusive prerogative of fairy tales as a common phenomenon of evolution. Does pragmatic value simply mean that in scientific circles an untrue explanation is considered better than no explanation? And there's a lot more information there. Embryology is affirmed by Professor Goddard in the Encyclopedia to afford strong evidence of evolution, but he admits that Haeckel's law of recapitulation is a gross exaggeration. In the 1929 Encyclopedia article on embryology by Professor D.M.S. Watson, Professor of Zoology at London University, we learn that research to confirm Haeckel can scarcely be said to have succeeded in its original aim. Chapter 5, Footprints on the Sands of Time. It has been said that a man studying the fossil remains of plants and animals can take away from them any theory he brings with him at the outset. In other words, the fossils themselves are one thing, and the inferences drawn from them are another matter altogether. In dealing with this part of evolution's evidence, it is thus advisable to bear in mind just what the rocks show. To begin with, the geologists divide the succession of strata in which fossils are found into three great ages. 1. The Paleozoic era, ancient life. The age of shells, corals, crabs, lobsters, and later the fishes on land. Scorpions and insects appear, and at the end of the period the earliest reptiles. Seaweeds are the earliest plants, followed by mosses and ferns on land, some growing to giant size in the swamp forests of the world's coal-bearing rocks of this era. 2. The Mesozoic era, middle life, the age notably of giant reptiles, in which the birds later appear. All this life reproduced by spawn or eggs. The first mammals producing their young alive also appear. Seed plants and trees are also found. 3. The Cainozoic era, newer life, the age of mammals and of flowering plants. These eras, also known as primary, secondary and tertiary, are subdivided into 15 periods. The earliest period of the Paleozoic era being known as the Cambrian. Each of the 3 geological ages is separated from the next by a marked physical break with upheavals or outbreaks of volcanic activity. The evolutionist contention is that the later forms of life seen in the rocks are the descendants of the earlier forms. The evolutionist infers this. The fossils themselves show no more than the order of succession in which the different types of plants and animals appeared. Transitional forms which must have existed if evolution is a fact, and for which names are allotted in advance after evolution became fashionable. Pro this and pro that have failed to appear, although the whole earth has been ransacked for them during the past 80 years. That's prior to this publication. And there's more information. It's probably about another 90 pages of it. We're not going to go through the whole thing. You could probably have a look at it yourself. It's at Internet Archive for free. Don't have to sign in or sign up or anything like that to borrow it. There's no time limit on it. Just look for that particular book. Okay, so we hope that you have found this interesting so far, that what we've read so far has proved evolution a fraud. But at the end of the day, you have to make up your mind if what was said is actually true or complete hokum. But so far we are aware that evolution, according to these experts, was proven a fraud by them. The whole thing was a farce. Okay, so if you enjoyed this video, subscribe to us, give us a like, add your comments below, and then go share this video with all your family, friends and others who may believe evolution is 100% true or believe that evolution is 100% baloney.